Hello and welcome to the Psych Leadership Podcast, the show that helps you understand the psychology of growth, leadership, and making big moves in your life and career. As always, my name's Luke UpChurch, and I'm so happy that you took time out of your day to hang out with me. Well, folks, welcome to Season 4. If you've been with me through Season 3, you've spent the last several months trying to build something real, a personal operating system for how you show up, how you protect your energy, how you see feedback, and how you say the hard things. That was all internal work on yourself. Season 4 is about what happens next when you take all that and step into a room where other people are now looking at you as the leader, right? That's what you've been building towards. So in this space, you're not just responsible for your own performance anymore. You're somebody's leader. And now it's time to figure out what that actually means. You know, for me, that shift, moving from an individual contributor where I was solely responsible for the outcomes, the objectives and key results and things like that, and pivoting to a place where now my success is dependent on others, where whether or not I meet my goals is a function of how I work through that team, right? That shift is real. And today, that's what we're talking about. The most disorienting transformation in any professional career is moving from peer to leader. And I want to start by breaking that down a little bit. Most people take this transition and they're not really prepared for it. Not because they lack the skill, but because nobody told them what they'd be stepping into in terms of that leadership role change. And it's a psychological one. It's a psychological one. And there are two very different things that come into play here. So as always, I do want to start with our research. Because I do think that the data here is both sobering and it's important to understand. But according to Gallup, only 18% of managers demonstrate a high level of natural talent in managing others. Just 18%. What that means is that the vast majority of people who step into leadership roles are doing it without any natural wiring that makes it feel intuitive. And more critically, without the training that would have helped make that difference. You knew that though, right? I've told you through my philosophy on leaders that I do not subscribe to the concept of a natural born leader. I feel like that's a misnomer. Well, I guess 18% of the time we can say that it's that a person is genetically predisposed, right? So I'm not completely wrong, but 18% of the time maybe they come out a little bit ahead. Harvard Business Review research puts the failure rate for new managers within their first 2 years at least 60%. So most folks are coming into this failing, right? Only 40% of them are hitting some level of success. And here's what makes that particularly relevant to this audience. It's that transition, like we talked about, from the individual contributor to leader is consistently identified in the research as one of the most psychologically demanding shifts in a professional's entire career. Not because the skills are impossible to learn, but because the identity shift requires something that most people don't anticipate, and organizations rarely prepare you for this. So a 2025 systematic review of leader identity research published in the Journal of Leadership found that the process of claiming a leader identity, actually internalizing that concept of I am a leader as part of how you see yourself, not just your title on an org chart, it's one of the most significant predictors of whether a new leader actually succeeds. People that can make that internal shift, that can flip that switch in their brain to go from, I am now a leader of people. People who make that internal shift perform differently than those that simply accept the external title. The ones who fail most often are the ones who got the promotion but never made that psychological move. So now let's talk about what actually changes and, in some cases, what doesn't. The thing about the transition that trips most people up is that when you move from peer to leader, the change that matters most isn't the job description itself. It's actually in the room. So before the transition, you were a colleague. You shared frustrations with your peers, right? You sat around and bonded over that asshole manager that you've all had to deal with, right? You were able to gripe about that, or talk about company changes, and it felt safe because everybody was in the same space, looking at it from the same general perspective in terms of where you sat on the hierarchy. Your relationship there was built on equality. Everybody was navigating that same terrain together. The moment that you step into a leadership role, though, that dynamic shifts whether you want it to or not. You're no longer just a colleague. Now you're somebody that influences people's career, their assessment, their growth, and in some cases, even their livelihood. I think for me personally, that was the piece that took a little bit to get my head around. And what I mean is when you realize that the decisions that you make, or that the planning that you do or fail to do, will ultimately impact whether or not your team has a job next year, next month, next week, right? And so, yes, they control their own destiny. Your team, to some extent, controls their own destiny. But it's quite possible that as a leader, for example, in my day job, we do a lot of budget planning right around this time of the year. So we have to sort of justify the budget that we were given in 2026, or budget we were given for 2026, I should say, and how we spent that money, right? Did we do the right things? Did we achieve the right goals? Did we spend that money as if it was our own, or did we burn through it way too early in the year? Based on how I make those decisions, even if I don't make them independently as a leader, even if I make those as a function of my team's involvement, on paper, I'm the guy who's actually submitting those, right? And as a leader, that's the position that you're put in. And so if, for example, if I completely screw up the budget, if I am constantly changing my team's goal, if I always move the goalpost, right? I can't be super surprised when they miss the goal. Well, then at the end of the year, right around this time, I'm already starting to have conversations about 2027, even 2028, right? So we're already starting to plan those things. If I didn't manage the budget, if I didn't manage the outcomes appropriately, do you think that my leaders are going to sign that check? Are they going to give us the funding to do what we anticipate doing in 2027? Well, obviously not, right? They're going to challenge that. And so those decisions, when that hits you, when you realize that because you did your job or didn't do your job, even if those factors were outside of your control, ultimately you're impacting somebody's livelihood. If I don't mentor and work with my team, and then as a direct result, they have a bad year-end review, right? I just took money out of their pockets. And at the same time, if I allow mediocre behavior, well, then I took money out of our collective team's pockets, not excluding my own, right? So that is a fundamental difference in the relationship. And pretending that it's not the most common thing out there is a costly mistake that a lot of people make, a lot of new leaders make. Some of them just sort of look past that and they say, well, I'm mature enough in my my emotional intelligence and so on, I can make that shift without it being awkward. And if you don't put a little bit of thought into it, a little bit of intentionality to it, that's an easy thing to trip over. Research on what sociologists call boundary role conflicts describes this exact phenomenon. New leaders find themselves caught in between two worlds: the peer relationship that they built on the way up and the authority relationship that their new role now requires. The social capital you accumulate as a peer doesn't automatically transfer credibility as a leader. And in fact, it can actually work against you if you try and manage the same people in the way that you used to relate to them. So I've watched this play out many times throughout my my experience. The new leader who tries to stay everyone's friend ends up not being an effective manager. Right. So again, I mean, you go from that position of we were buds. We went to concerts together. We played disc golf or met after lunch met after work to go have lunch, etc. And then you try and be super buddy. Well, either your team doesn't take you seriously or they kind of take advantage of you. Right. They play that friendship against you, and you're trying to be liked. So you let them, right? The new leader who overcorrects, who suddenly becomes super formal and distant because they're trying to, wear that hat, act as a leader. Well, now they lost trust in the people that they spent years building that trust with. Neither extreme works, right? What works is something kind of down the middle, and that requires a level of self-awareness that most people don't develop until they've already made the mistake itself. So let's talk about that psychological shift and what that actually looks like, because I think naming it will make it a little bit easier to navigate. As an individual contributor, your primary question is, how do I perform? Your success is measured by your outputs, your ideas, your execution. You are a unit of production. Leadership changes that equation entirely, right? As a leader, your primary question becomes, how do the people around me perform? Your success is now measured by the outcomes that you didn't necessarily produce yourself. That's not to say that as a leader you won't still have some individual projects, but to give you an idea, when I started formally leading people, I went from being probably 80% individual contributor, 20% teamwork, to maybe 10% individual contributor, and we'll say another 10 to 15 where I'm working with my peer group. So it's still kind of, group project where we all contribute as a team, but I'm within my peer group. And then all the rest is spent either working with your directs on whatever your outcomes are, whatever your team produces, and save a little bit in there for development, right? Because if all you're doing is pushing towards the numbers, your team burns out really, really quick. Okay? So as your success, like I said, your success is now measured by outcomes that you didn't necessarily produce yourself. In any case, now you're in a space that your success is measured by outcomes that you didn't necessarily produce yourself. It's by the growth of the people that you're responsible for leading. It's a function of the environment that you create, not just the work that you do. And that's not a small adjustment, right? That's a complete reorientation about what it means to do your job. There was some additional research published in the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology in 2025. It found that when people develop what researchers call future leader self, a clear mental image of themselves operating as a leader, not just holding that leadership title, they demonstrate significantly higher motivation to lead and more proactive leadership behavior. The research calls this identity-based motivation. So you don't just behave your way into leadership, right? You see yourself as a leader first. That internal shift, that paradigm shift, has to be specific enough to actually guide your behavior in real situations. This connects directly to the identity audit that we talked about back in Season 3. If you remember who you are when the title disappears, that same question applies here, but in reverse. So who are you now that the title has arrived? Because it's the only thing that really changed on your business card. The transition hasn't happened yet, right? All right, so now let's pivot to the transition framework. 3 conversations that you have to have. Today, I really want to leave you with some practical tools that you can put into use. So to start us off here, research on successful leadership transitions consistently points to one behavior that separates new leaders who navigate this well from those that didn't: explicit conversations about the change. Okay? So this isn't just issuing a memo about your new authority. It's actual direct human conversations about what has shifted and what hasn't. There are 3 conversations every new leader needs to have in this transitions. So conversation 1 is with your former peers. So acknowledge the shift directly, not awkwardly, not formally, just honestly. Something like this. The dynamic between us has changed, and I want to name that rather than pretend that it hasn't. I still value the relationship that we've built, and I want to be clear that my job now includes things that it didn't before, including being accountable for the outcomes of this team. I'm figuring out how to do that well, and I'd rather do it with you around me. Okay? That conversation really needs to be done early. It prevents months of confusion and resentment on your team. This really applies in the space that you are promoted within the same team that you were formerly a part of, right? And at least in my experience, typically on every team, there's 2 or 3 people that are kind of bubbling to the top, right? So there's a good chance that not only are you now their boss, but that you beat them to the punch of that job, right? You were all going for it. You won. And so sometimes there's some animosity there. Sometimes people aren't quite as emotionally intelligent or business mature as they should be at that stage in their career. So I've been in this position several times. I couldn't agree more with this research. It's something that every time I've been in this space, I like to pull the folks aside and kind of have sort of an informal coffee or something like that, and I just call it out. The research that sentence that I gave you there, naming it and letting them know that yes, some things have changed, some things haven't. That's basically how I've laid it out. I would tell you to lean into the relationships that you have with that group, and don't just regurgitate what I gave you here, but make it hit home, right? So for me, it was always something to the effect of, hey, I've really enjoyed working as a team. I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to jump into this role and know exactly what I'm doing. What I will tell you is that I'm constantly open for feedback, and I can't do it right if I don't know where I've done wrong, right? If I do something wrong, something that doesn't land well with you, I need to hear those things. I'm not going to tell you that I'm necessarily going to change them, but I need to understand the impact. And I'll be honest with you and give you that feedback, and I would really appreciate that same respect. And just being open to the fact that you don't know everything and that you want to learn from them and learn together, I'm telling you, that really, really helps. So the second conversation I'm going to recommend, again, this is with your team. Tell them how you intend to lead. And this isn't a speech, it's a direct statement about what you care about, how you make decisions, and what they should expect from you. Now, I do this not only when I've been promoted into a position of leadership, but I actually use this same concept whenever somebody new joins my team. I like to have a quick virtual coffee with them. I tell them a little bit about what our projects are. I mean, they got some of that in the interview, right? Hopefully, if you've done your job. But they're going to have questions. So I give them a little bit more in depth. I peel the curtain back a little bit more and tell them about what we're doing, what they specifically are doing. And then I like to tell them a little bit about my leadership style. So I let them know that I lead with psychological safety, that I am a servant leader through and through. I let them know the best ways to communicate with me. In any case, telling folks your leadership style, how you make decisions, how you like to be communicated with, and listen to them too. If you've ever watched the show Ted Lasso, he was that character was fantastic at this, right? He was so good at meeting people right where they were, listening to how they like to be communicated with, how they react when when you call them out for positive or negative things, right? Understanding those dynamics and actually changing your leadership around them wins you huge points. So this is a conversation, like I said, have this when you were newly promoted. Have this when somebody new joins your team too. The third conversation is more of a self-reflection. This is the one that most people skip, frankly. And here I want you to take an honest look at what you're bringing into the role and what you're leaving behind. What habits do you have that made you a great individual contributor? Right? That's doing everything yourself, solving every problem, being the smartest person in the room, maybe, or at least being the subject matter expert on a specific task. Well, those habits will actively work against you as a leader if you don't consciously release them. The skills that got you here are not the same skills that will make you successful in your next chapter. And knowing that's going to change and how you're going to approach that transition. Okay? All right. So hopefully that gives you a good framework now that you've moved from I want to be a leader to I am a leader, and that's really what we're going to focus on in this season. Season 3 was all about building yourself, understanding who you are, protecting your capacity, all those things. And that work doesn't stop. I want to reiterate that. So if you haven't heard that, make that a point. If you're new to the series, go back, check out Season 3. Lots of good stuff there. But Season 4 is all about what to do when other people are now involved. When the work isn't just about how you perform, but about the environment you created and the people around you. Okay? All right, folks. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Again, remember, I've moved over to Spotify, so now you have the ability to communicate with me much easier. Leave me a comment, ask me a question. Happy to help if I can. Thank you so much, and have a great day.